Hello, my name is Lauren Silva, and the book I chose to do was The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So, this book had a lot of tragedy and a lot of magic, but what I started to notice was the way that Hawthorne chose to write about men and women in this book. And that's what I really want to talk about, and more specifically, the history of the time and the way the characters all interact, but just symbolism and things that don't really have to do with the characters. So, in the story, there are flashbacks, but there are also cases where the characters will share the stories with each other. Um, and the first half of the book is mostly just background, and it takes a while to get to the action of it. But a lot of important things happen in the beginning, like Phoebe arriving and Clifford arriving, and Hepzibah opening up the scent shop. And an important thing about Hepzibah is that she's really nearsighted and it causes her to frown. So I thought that this quote was relevant. It says, her scowl had done her very ill office in establishing her character as an ill-tempered old maid. So the locals would say that she could scare away all the customers in her shop. And it's a really stark contrast from what we see because, Phoebe is described as this really sunny presence, a youthful presence and lively. And so it's very different. And the only other person who lives with them is the artist, Mr. Holgrave, and of course Clifford. And other than that, one of the first things that we learn is that there's a huge portrait of the Colonel on the wall, but they're not allowed to take it down. And I think this is where you start to see this man's influence the first time, because it's officially 2 centuries since he died, and his kin are still afraid of removing his painting. So this is totally different from Clifford, who seems to be terrified of everything he sees. The Colonel's not afraid of anything. And he's not any different from the judge, who we meet later. And this is important because everything we know about the Colonel is the same as the judge. They are one and the same. And there's a whole chapter about it called The Pyncheon of Today. So the Colonel is relevant to me. This is one quote in particular. It says, bold, imperious, relentless, crafty, laying his purposes deep and following them out with an inveteracy of pursuit that knew neither rest nor conscience, trampling on the weak and, when essential to his ends, doing his utmost to beat down the strong. So, of course, this is supposed to be about the Colonel, but it's definitely relevant for him and the judge. For the Colonel, the strong would be Maul. But for the judge, I guess it would be Clifford or maybe his wife, since his wife passed away. I'm not really sure what to say about that. But the thing about Clifford is that he's really just a huge baby. And we're constantly seeing Phoebe and Hepzibah taking care of him and cleaning up after him. And for example, a good example is this very picture, which is a scene where there was a parade happening on the street down below, and Clifford tried to jump down into the parade. There was also another time where Hepzibah took an egg from one of the Pyncheon hens that hadn't laid an egg in years and fed it to Clifford. And Clifford's broken because of what happened to him in the past, and that includes finding his dead uncle and then being blamed for his dead uncle's murder. And now, of course, we know by the end of the book that nobody ended up murdered at all. But Clifford was there when the judge died, and he was there when his uncle Jaffrey died, so those things are traumatizing. Clifford could be sort of a feminine presence. There's a lot of talk about his eyebrows, his hair, how gentle he is, but he's never taken any kind of a lover, and instead of feminine, I would say he's more childlike. There's definitely still a lack of masculine energy. But with the judge, there's this very masculine energy, and I think something about the time period is that masculine energy can sometimes be seen as control and vice versa. Control can be mistaken as masculine energy. And so we're seeing that a lot in this book. Hawthorne, this is Hawthorne, he was writing about a time in the past, and he was writing a story within a story about the Pyncheons, of 200 years ago versus the Pyncheons of today. And so for his time period, he was very aware. You see a lot of quotes, mostly from Judge Pyncheon, and he's pretty much the only one who says this. where he'll tell Hepzibah demeaning things, mostly because she won't let him through to see Clifford, and he'll say things about how women always get in the way. Um, and that was actually how it all came to a head in the first place, was he tried to force her to go get Clifford so that he could interview Clifford about this deed for land. And we see more and more of this controlling personality that was really prevalent during this time period. And I think Hawthorne was really trying to make a critique on these kinds of men, these domineering types of personalities. And I think that this is obvious because the three other men who, live till the end of this story have none of that ugliness in their personalities. Holgrave has some of it. And the reason I say that is because we learned about his ancestors when we learned about Alice Pyncheon. And Matthew Mall enslaved Alice Pyncheon with magic. And when Holgrave is in the garden with Phoebe one day, he has the opportunity, they both feel it, where he could do that to her, and he chooses not to. There's something in his character that, makes him not want to do that. And so you're faced with this comparison of Phoebe and Alice, where they're very similar but very different, where Alice was a little bit more hard-headed, but in the end, they end up the same, kind of. And you also see this comparison of Matthew Mall and Holgrave, where Holgrave is not giving into this instinct that he has that's also genetic. Um, so, regardless, we're faced with all these different kinds of men, and most importantly, we see which people are starting to bring about the downfall of this family and the house. And we keep seeing these personality types. The colonel who's controlling and he steals the land from Matthew Mall, and he ends up dying. And then we have the judge, and he ends up trying to force Hepzibah to do what he wants, and he dies shortly after that. And of course, being evil never got anyone anywhere. And Matthew Mall died as he was casting a curse on these people. So this kind of made me think of the writing of Judith Sargent Murray, because at the end of this story, all of the good people live, and they're able to move on. And the very end of the book includes Alice Pyncheon flying towards heaven, and there's no mention of anyone else going to heaven. That's why I think the quote on the screen is relevant, because I think that it shows a disconnect from God, and I think that it is a societal thing. Because there were times when the judge had the opportunity to be better than he was, and he wasn't. Um, and I think this kind of ties into my next point, because Alice definitely deserved to go to heaven after what she went through. And everything she went through, realistically, was young Matthew Mall's fault. Or I guess if you want to think about it, it would be the Colonel's fault through this long chain of events. And the only legacy she leaves behind is her harp and her posies on the roof of the Seven Gables. And that brings me to my second point. I'm not sure if there really was a curse or not, even though all the terms of the curse are confirmed in the end, and it doesn't make a difference anyway, because I saw things a little bit differently. I really wondered if the house and Alice's posies were meant to be symbolic in some way. The house is this huge, dark, looming structure, and perched right on top of the house are Alice's posies. And the way I see it, there's these flowers, growing out of the roof. And I think that it was directly the Colonel's fault that Alice was enslaved to Matthew Mall all those years ago because of the bad blood between the families. And you really see how this toxicity infects a bloodline for generations and generations, and how lying and being ingenuine can cause harm to people you love. And I think the only way that the family could really be at peace was by leaving the house. But they couldn't leave the house. They were stuck there because it was all that they had to pass on to future generations when they didn't have any money. So this is symbolic for a couple of reasons. I see the dark house as a masculine presence. It's big, it's massive, and people are afraid to come near it. And at the end of the book, when Alice's posies finally start to bloom, there's something obviously bright and red in the middle of all that darkness, and the fact that the posies are right on top of the roof, and Alice goes to heaven, and there's no mention of anyone else going to heaven, I think is symbolic to me as well. So, not only are the family able to move on once they're out from under that presence, but it also explains why Alice went to heaven and I'm focusing on these characters specifically because they're the few ancestors that you really get to know about. So, this symbolism stuck out to me in terms of Emily Dickinson's poem My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun because of the connection between inanimate objects and engendered presence. So I felt that the gun had female presence, and this made sense because the owner of the gun was a male. So the second way that this house is symbolic is that it literally took them generations to finally get rid of the thing. So I really think that the house is a metaphor for that toxic masculinity and it plays a bigger role than I think most people believe at first. So overall, I think that this book was meant to be subtly, of course, a critique on those kinds of men and that kind of presence, how it can be really harmful to have this domineering nature around. And that's the way I see it. Thank you.